Hello, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We had some technical issues with the platform we used, but we are here now. Oh man, I hate when things like this happen, but appreciate you guys hanging in there for a few minutes. Well, with that, since we have limited time, let's kick it off. So, Jason, also thank you for your patience here.
Cool.
Really, nothing ever goes perfectly, right? But really excited to have you for this AMA today. So, our guest today is Jason Gurnberg, the CMO of Bluecore, a retail marketing platform that enables marketers to turn data into revenue generating campaigns in minutes. Jason has more than 2 decades of experience leading large-scale marketing efforts at companies like Sailthrough and Gold and now Bluecore. But you've had a ton of trips around the block. So maybe Jason, you can introduce yourself for a few minutes, and then we'll dive into
Yeah,
the question.
certainly. First of all, thanks again for having me. Really excited about the chat. And as I was thinking about today, like this is just about, for me, kind of like all of us coming together to make each other smarter and help each other like in this next phase of where go-to-market is going. So I've been a lifelong marketer. I originally thought I was going to be a political correspondent, and then I spent about like 1 week in New York State politics, and I decided that wasn't the future for me. But I ended up on the agency side and spent the first decade of my career in agency, and then moved over to Sailthrough, and that started a 10-year journey on the SaaS side for me, and here I am today. So I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and really excited about the team that I'm leading here and what we're up to, and that I've gotten to meet you in that process, Lily.
Well, it's great to have you. And I think I'm excited to chat with you too, because one of the threads of your career, at least for the last decade, has really been around SaaS that does personalization.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that AI does extremely well is personalization. So I'm curious to hear from you how you've seen personalization move the needle for your products, and I guess how you're thinking about that when it comes to you building your marketing team.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a lot of data around the impact that personalization has on conversion. But the way I like to think about it is, especially, through the lens of retail, which I've spent, most of the last decade working on personalization for retail or for publishing, is like, I think about the buyer and the brand. And like, as a retailer, your goals are fundamentally at odds with your consumers' goals. Like every retailer is thinking about how they get their consumers to spend more money. And like, I don't wake up every day thinking about how I spend more money. Typically I think about like, how do I spend less of it? And so there's like a fundamental break there that in what the desires are of the audiences. And I think personalization is the means for having those end up on the same playing field. You're offering a consumer a more relevant contextual experience. It's faster, quicker discovery for them when they are in the shopping mode, which is like less than 3% of every day. And so, but most marketing doesn't act that way. Most marketing acts as if as a consumer, you're shopping nearly 24 hours a day. Really far from the truth. And so I think when you apply that to other industries, it's the same thing in media and publishing. Like people are consuming some form of content like way more than they used to today, but like you're not reading like news articles all the time. You're not ready for that in email or in social or whatnot. Like there are times where I might be on TikTok, but like I don't pay attention to my news sources that I get through TikTok. Every moment of every day, I do it at certain points of the day. And so understanding the context in which every individual is in, I think has been the like ultimate dream of personalization, but it really hasn't been well executed. And I get excited about where what's coming from an AI perspective is going to take that.
Yeah, definitely interesting. I think you're spot on in terms of the kind of percentage of mind share that you're able to capture. We had a bunch of questions that were submitted by attendees previously. So I'm going to start going through them. But for everyone on the call, feel free to chime in, add anything to the chat. We'll make this an interactive conversation. One of the questions that I thought would be really great to start off with is where you think AI is going to have the biggest impact on B2B marketing in the short term. So probably in the next 12 months.
I think the opportunities from a B2B marketing perspective are really on the account research side of things and the outreach side of things. So from a research perspective, I think there's a host of tools that B2B organizations use to better understand their prospect and the context in which they're existing. But there's such a pressure that's put on the traditional outbound team or the marketing team to move with speed. And there's like friction between like totality of research and really understanding an account um, and getting the right messages out to them. And so I think in the very near term, it's already happening, right? Like we see the use of ChatGPT and other LLM tools for the ability to better understand the context in which account exists rather than going through like 10K filings and, going through website press releases and things along those lines. And then it is like the inbound and outbound funnel itself. I mean, with the ability to create content with like endless number of variations, what's soon coming from a visual perspective, I think the ability to actually deploy personalization in B2B is going to be there like at scale, really like at that individual level. And that's been something that's been missing. It's largely been segment based, I think, at best, or category level at best. And so I think those two areas are going to really change how we staff. I think there's significant impact to the SDR and outbound function. I think there's significant impact to the AE function and what they're responsible for. And then even within marketing, it's about hiring and people and growing people into being like AI literate and AI enabled versus not utilizing the tools that are at hand.
I definitely want to dive a lot into team construction and how that's going to shift. But one question I have based off of what you just mentioned is, let's take the account research side and then some of the execution, both from an outbound and inbound perspective. How do you see that information permeating the team, passing through? I found historically there's often different people who are doing some of the intel gathering research, and that needs to somehow get translated into the people who are doing the outbound, inbound personalization. How, I guess, would you see that best structured in this new paradigm?
Well, I think that's a part of a demand generation function, or like a modern demand generation function, where, especially in an organization like Bluecore, where like we have 1,000 targets right now that we're going after. We only focus on enterprise retail. Like we should have that intelligence institutionalized across the company. And so like that ability, I think that is a core part of enterprise demand gen, is knowing who you're going after and what they do. I think for organizations though, where they're much broader in terms of their target, it becomes like almost then like at like I think it's closer to the downstream, like sales side of things, where you would see that intelligence living and really, being shared around, and almost those AEs acting like quarterbacks of like, hey, based on what we learned, like this is the set of plays we should be running. I need to get this executive involved and up to speed onto what's happening in the account. I need product marketing to understand what's going on here as well, because that might change like overall messaging and positioning. And so it depends on, are you enterprise? Are you commercial? How big is the TAM, the SAM, the SOM, and all of those things?
Yes, one kind of more spicy take in terms of medium or long term. How much of that do you see still being done by humans versus being done by products and tools? Meaning you get intel using some form of AI tool on your target account. So maybe you feed it, here are 1,000 accounts that we're targeting. Now it gathers information, it understands what your product does. Do we need all those humans to create the playbooks, to educate people, to go and create the different various components? Where do you see that moving?
Look, I think that's where AI enabled comes into this. I think people need to be trained on how to use it, right? And the organization needs to understand like where the intelligence is coming from, where it's going, who's it's being served to, and whatnot. And it's almost making like that part of demand generation like quarterbacking of that information versus like processing it themselves and spinning up the variants and whatnot. And so I think the roles change greatly because of that. I you don't need the same level of like sweat equity, I think, or production put into things at that point, but it really is like, is the organization using the intelligence that's available to them or not? That to me ends up being the role.
Somebody had asked a question that is kind of on this thread around whether marketing specialization is going to lose value over time or even disappear with further development in AI. How do you see that happening? One thing that's been fascinating to me, if you look at org charts across different business units within enterprise companies, there's no other org chart that looks like marketing in terms of its kind of fragmentation and specialization of people. So curious to get your take on that.
That's I think I'm going to struggle on this one a little bit because it's when I think about content, for example, or I think about creative, again, it's like, is there a kind of head of content, or head of creative, or a creative director that sets the strategy and then the execution is managed by AI? Like I could see that being like very likely like a near-term future. But I still think you want, in my mind, you still want that creative director that's setting like the intention on this and understanding like what that creative strategy looks like. But then you have the ability to scale it. I think from a events perspective, and actually like what happens from like a field marketing perspective, there's a part of this where like my goal is to get people. I call it a relationship demand gen chain, where we need points of view that drive to points of entry, that drive to points of conversion, that drive to points of leverage. And the way I see this happening is like at points of view, there's initial kind of like there's the human side of that where we need to understand like what should those points of view be, and that definitely is like AI enabled by the research, right? And where the research is AI enabled, and AI can even help us identify like what are the possibilities of point of view here, what are the ones that we choose out of that though. Points of entry is the content itself, and like I think that becomes completely taken by AI outside of like the topmost direction. Points of entry for me on the enterprise side, like that's face-to-face interaction with people. And so like you need people to have that with one another. And that's where relationships start getting built. And points of leverage is where we take actual human intelligence, like from a retail strategy perspective at Bluecore, and bring that into play. And so I think like there's a space for it throughout, but like the individual team members that are important in that relationship demand gen chain for me, like they change in terms of like where I could put resources. It would be great to have 6 people focusing on points of conversion versus 6 people focused on points of entry. And so I look at it and say, like, that's where I want to drive more dollars to. I can't cost effectively do that today because I'd be way out of spend benchmark.
I love that framing. I might have to steal it at some point, but I like how essentially you've identified the 4 areas that are really critical to human input, but it's more now of a shifting of resources to focus on the things further down funnel that are going to drive more impact for the business.
Yeah.
Sarah asked a really interesting question that I hear all of the time. So this will be really fun to hear your answer, is around how a lot of B2B marketers are pretty wary or resistant to AI because it's a new way of thinking, a new mode of operating. Some people probably feel like their jobs may be threatened. What do you think is needed to break through that resistance and get those marketers to adopt?
I think there's a really potential, like the first thing to me is like consequences, right? Like, yeah, like people's jobs are going to change and evolve. And if you're resistant to that change or that evolution, I think you're at risk. And so I think there are going to be consequences tied towards resistance in that. But more than anything, what is marketing if not experimentation? And like the context around a marketer is always changing. And so if you're just doing what you did a decade ago, because that's what you did a decade ago, and you saw it worked a decade ago, I feel like that thought process is irrelevant. And so if you take the perspective that the power in marketing is derived through experimentation, then you would just naturally be wanting to be inquisitive and experiment with kind of what's coming down the pike. And so I would talk about it through that lens, where this isn't about like making a bet that's going to replace like 90% of a team. This is about experimenting with where and how we're going to scale and what does that mean. Certainly there are implications for it, but it's an experiment.
I like that a lot. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is there's a lot of parallels I'm seeing play out with AI, with what we saw with RPA or robotic process automation about a decade ago. Initially, when it started getting adopted, people started looking at their current workflows saying, where are the really manual repetitive tasks? And let me go and automate them. And now it's very similar where people's mindset is, what is my current workflow and where can AI help with the parts I don't like to do? But there's a subset of people who are thinking, like you just described, of I need to be experimenting. I need to be pushing the bounds. I need to be thinking about what was never possible before. And I think we're going to start to see a pretty big bifurcation between the teams who think and execute like that versus the teams who are really stuck in their current workflow ways. Um, and it'll be interesting, I guess, as a marketing leader, how do you think about both inspiring and also bringing your team on board to that way of thinking, as opposed to creating this kind of, leader versus team?
Yeah, I think what you just did, right? Like we can look back at various inflection points and show evidence of the benefits of being like on the early side of things. And just even through like the consumer facing lens, like when being at sale through early on, we would speak to a lot of marketers about kind of personalization and putting that at the beginning of the creation process versus at the end. Because most organizations are like, oh, like we did this thing, we have this campaign. How do we personalize it? And rather we'd say like, well, think about like what makes your brand and your buyer unique. What should you be personalizing? How should you be personalizing? And then what campaigns does that create based on that? How are you going outbound? So you put that first. I think we can see where that's the brands that have done that well. Like I ran a project back at Sale Through called the Retail Personalization Index, and we looked at 500 retail organizations based on how well they connected and personalized the customer experience across like 90 touch points of the experience. And when we looked at the top 100, the highest performing quartile, like you even go to like their brand values, and it was personalization was throughout it. It was like about like relevancy to the buyer and value to the buyer and things along those lines. And some even like Textile Fashion Group, one of their core brand pillars of their core company pillars was offering a personalized experience. Then you go to the bottom quartile, and they were all things like value for money. And I'm like, that felt like the 1970s. It just felt so out of touch with where things were. And then if you go back even a decade before, mobile, right? Like any organization that was starting to think about like, what do we need to do for mobile first, and then what comes after it versus, oh, we built this thing, now let's make it mobile. Like they moved ahead in the game. And so I kind of see this as one of those next points of inflection where we can go back and look at history and say, like, what was it? What was the benefit of being early? It's clear when it comes to embracing the use of new technology. And so to me, like that's what I would say to people. And like, like the best place, the best opportunity now is to get smart on what's happening and understand and develop hypotheses around it. And if you can demonstrate that you are an AI-enabled thinker, an operator, I think there's room for growth and evolution in everybody's role because you can't teach the drive to do that. People either have it or they don't. And so I tend to hire people and celebrate people who have that drive versus those that don't. And so like my expectation is like the team that I lead and the people that I've led previously are going to get after this.
And I think you're exactly right. It can't be a bolt-on afterthought. It has to start with the core DNA around, two things that you've mentioned multiple times. It's this culture of experimentation, and that is really what marketing should be. And the second is personalization as a core competency of what you're doing. And I think that just doesn't work when you're trying to go and retroactively do it. It has to start with how you think about campaigns from scratch.
Yeah. And like I've been spending so much time looking at the evolution of the tech stack, not just from a B2B perspective, but largely from B2C, given that's who I'm marketing to. And when we look at it, like there are clear gaps from identification, personalization, orchestration, experimentation, and optimization. Like these tech stacks have created these experience gaps because there's something with the data and with what's needed from a content or creative or execution perspective. And when I think about like AI and Gen AI, like it's actually built to close those gaps. And like that's what I get incredibly excited about of like, okay, maybe what we've been talking about in marketing for the last 15 years, that idea of like the segment of one or like one-to-one personalization, whatever you want to call it, where it's not about like content of an email, it's about the totality of your journey that is completely customized to you. I think it's becoming possible. And that is so exciting to me. Like, but it does mean that large enterprise organizations are going to have to completely rethink organizational design. They're going to have to completely rethink the processes in which they operate. And like, this is a complete overhaul to people, process, and technology. And so, like, whether you're thinking about GTM or go to market on the B2B or B2B side, B2C side, like, gosh, like we're coming into some really exciting things.
And, to your point, it's an overhaul of people, process, and technology. And it also, even to your point about what AI is good at today, let's take the research side. It's not just researching the account. If you're going at an individual level, it's also researching the individual that you're targeting and pairing that with information. And so it's overhauling even that thought process around what does account research look like today. And so I think it's going to be really cool to see how that all evolves. And I also think it'll be interesting to see how the interplay between teams evolves. I'm curious if you have thoughts there. One of the things I've found historically, there's always friction between marketing and sales. And, it's marketing's not passing us good enough leads and sales not following up with them and they're not using our playbooks and all that stuff. Curious how you think that either is helped or hurt when we rethink our processes and technology.
Well, I historically view sales as being slower to change than marketing is. And this is going to be one of those areas that I think creates more friction because what marketing is going to be the first to move here. And then there's going to be resistance inside of like middle and bottom of funnel of like how are they to thinking about AI in process overhaul from a sales perspective and like ongoing outreach and content generation and who owns what. And my view is like the greatest salespeople are quarterbacks of a relationship and quarterbacks of a process. They're not like sole contributors. And so I think that the sales executives or account executives or whatever we want to call them who act that way now are going to be successful in this because like what they care about is getting something over the line and the best path to do that. They don't care about being the one who did it. Because what they want is the paycheck at the end of the day. The people who care deeply about getting like owning all of that process are going to be the ones resistant to change and like they're going to be very challenged. So I think it's going to create like same thing like what we were saying before, like even in marketing, like a great divide almost of like who's in the now versus like who's outdated in this process.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. We'll definitely start to see like separation of the wheat from the chaff in terms of a lot of functions.
But I think it could be a great opportunity for those who are less tenured and more tech enabled already in their career and like to kind of level jump and start thinking about this rather than potentially those that have been doing this for a very long time who aren't, ready for this or desiring of this. So I think it creates a bit of like a leveling of the playing field almost in some areas, which will be really interesting.
I was listening to a podcast on this and it was talking about in general, I think AI is going to affect the different levels within an organization. And they were saying that it tends to benefit the younger, earlier people in their career. And then also leaders who are really forward thinking. And the people who get most negatively affected are kind of those middle management who are kind of that, liaison between the executives and the ICs, but also who are very stuck in their ways. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah. I was talking the other day to somebody about org design and hierarchy, and I tend to look at things more from a time horizon perspective than a level perspective. And so for me, like I believe that like my job is on a like 36 to 48 month time horizon. I need to be looking that far out to make sure that the direction our organization is going in is appropriate for how the market's going to move. And then as kind of get closer to the day-to-day execution, your time horizon kind of comes in. But like, I still want somebody looking after the next 12 to 18 months. And they need people who are looking after the next like 6 to 12 months. And they need people who are looking after like the next like 6 months down to like the next 3 weeks. And so when I think about what the future of how that is impacted by AI, I think what's really interesting is like part of my job is to teach people how to expand that time horizon and that view. And I think that this is a great enabling tool for doing that and demonstrating to people like, what does this look like in a practical application of like what is the how do you expand that from like 3 weeks to 6 months? Like, what are the frameworks you need? Like, what are the questions you need to be asking yourself or answering in order to think that way? And so it's like the computer chess model, right? Where you're playing against like the computer opponent, like they're showing you moves that you hadn't seen before. And I think that that's pretty exciting here from a development perspective as well.
And I like the time frame, kind of frame of thinking, because things are shifting so quickly on the technology side too, that if you're not thinking in terms of short, medium, long, breaking that down, I think people are going to struggle with figuring out how to be adaptable and experimental when it comes to using some of these tools. One of the things, so we got a few variations of this question around what are some of the innovative ways either you and your team or other marketers you've kind of seen or come across are trying to use AI today in various ways, and also, what you're most excited about coming down the pike.
So I'll answer this question two ways. So first, I am really like a big voice about this inside of our organization, especially when it comes to like product and technology team. And so like my job is CMO, but my job is the leadership team, right? And so I'm trying to push our engineering and product teams to be thoughtful of like how should this change our overall product based on, again, like where the market's going. And so I think about it from a like even an extensibility perspective. Like, are we investing in research around like, can we use this as a means to build ad hoc integrations between our technology and another technology? And does that type of extensibility drive new opportunities for us from a marketing perspective and a demand generation perspective? Like, what does that future look like if we put those resources in and say like, okay, like we have our like in-house kind of proprietary way of analyzing your tech stack and your data flows, and we're going to build custom build the perfect way for our technology to integrate into your stack based on the use cases that you so desperately want to kind of complete or bring to life. I think that's really exciting. And like the idea of that to me means like you can take this, like you can take a look at your tech stack and not think that it's impossible to lift and shift or to move things around. It becomes like who's got the best for you right now and based on what you have. And so I think that's really interesting. And I want to influence the rest of the organization that way. In terms of like what we're thinking about in marketing right now, like it's really, to me, it's about the content side of things. Like we're having a conversation about like, do we need an SEO agency? I don't know though.
Does SEO go away?
Yeah, right. But like in the next 36 months, no, I don't think it goes away. Or maybe in the next 24 months, right? But like, in that time frame, because there's a lot of people that need to change like the way that they operate for that. But like, should we be spending those dollars every single month, or should we be like just using this as a means to understand like the right keywords and develop the content behind it and use that as a test, and where would we deploy that capital? And so right now it really is about like asking the questions of every line item in the budget of like, hey, what if, or hey, how could, and putting, I think, a plan of like tests together with the whole team to give everybody visibility into this and where it's going. Like that's the kind of stuff I get really excited about.
And man, that first piece you talked about of like seamless product integration, I cannot wait for that, even from our perspective and our builds and stuff like that. That would just be dream scenario.
Truly. But like we're starting to get there, right? Like that's not that far off. And I think about it from a and even like a product influence perspective. And I want us to invest in, if I can give a retailer the ability to take their brand creative and just like go with that book, and we can then customize all of that imagery based on an individual's preferences so that every hero image or whatever it is features what she's predicted to purchase next. And like there's video that shows how somebody who looks like her looks in that garment. Like that's and I go back to that, like if a retailer's goal is to sell more, but a consumer's goal isn't, it's to understand like how they're going to better live their life. Um, you can use this to connect those two. It is what is going to drive that connection.
Yes, and I think that's to your point before around this one-to-one personalization. I always joke when on a shopping website, like I'm tiny, I'm like 5'2", extremely slight, very athletic build, and I see these model shots on people who look literally polar opposite to me, and I can't see myself in that garment then. And I think that's where we get to how do you increase conversion through personalization? It's things exactly like that. It's how do you go and sell me, show me something that resonates with me directly, and that could be from a product image, that could be from a content perspective, an email perspective, an ad perspective, anything like that. And that's one of the things I get most excited about.
And I think we've talked about personalization for so long that I think we need to like call it something different. If it's just individualization, maybe that's what it is, because it's not like, or is it the humanization of it? Like, I don't know what
I like that.
we need to think about it, but like it's something different because personalization means so many different things to so many marketers. Like the fact that like I used to joke, like you could have a cocktail party and like talk about personalization with four people and everybody walks away thinking that they had like a very different conversation because somebody was talking about segmentation, somebody else was talking about what we're talking about, somebody else was just talking about like an ad. And I'm like, this is just like, it's wildly ridiculous how varying the definition is. But it's that those definitions have been created based on the limitations of technology. And now that those limits are being removed, I think it's like high time for us to talk about it through a different context.
I love the idea of creating a new term. I like, whether it's individualized marketing or something, but I agree it needs a new term and a new definition around what that term means.
Yeah.
Well, I know I've taken you over. One really quick last question, and then we'll wrap things up. Are there any areas that you're cautious about or trying to essentially kind of rein in the team? I know people have different variations of fear around this, but I'm curious, you personally, whether there's certain things you would say, hey, I'm cautious here.
Look, we're working really closely with our CISO, like our Chief Information Security Officer, just about like from that aspect of it. Like, what tools are we
Yeah.
using? What ways are we using them? Like, what type of data are we putting out there? Like, when I think about it from a Bluecore perspective, like the volume of consumer data that exists inside of Bluecore is incredibly vast. Our like the depth of our product catalog on all these brands is third to Amazon and Shopify. Like that's how large it
Yeah.
is. So like the that is for many of these brands proprietary. And um, there's consumer privacy that you need to be thinking about in this. And so like you want to think about like what the dream is, but you also want to operate ethically within that and experiment effectively but securely. And so this is where a lot of people are trying to like run, like go from like the like crawl, walk, run, fly, like just to fly. And I think you need to go through the experimentation cycle on it. And so I get like wary of anything that's just like jump in full steam versus like operate as if this is an experiment and understand the implications of it.
Yeah. And take, when it comes to sensitive data, err on the side of caution.
Absolutely, right?
Well, exactly. Well, Jason, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I feel like we need to do round two in about 9 months just to see how much things have changed just in that
Yeah.
time frame. But really appreciate your time and all your insights, and look forward to hearing how you guys have evolved your marketing team at Bluecore.
Cheers. Thanks, Elaine, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.